Following the research briefing, current and former Chief Resilience Officers from New Jersey, North Carolina, and South Carolina will join me to discuss how their state governments are rising to the challenge with long-range adaptation plans that reach across sectors and agency silos. Later, we'll hear from Brenda Mallory, Chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Chair Mallory will discuss resilience and adaptation initiatives in the works within the Biden-Harris administration and opportunities for state and federal partnerships as part of the administration's whole of government approach. But before we get into today's program, for those of you that may not be as familiar with us, the Pew Charitable Trusts is a global non-governmental organization that seeks to improve public policy and invigorate civic life through research and advocacy, with a commitment to facts, science, data, and measurable results. Commensurate with these goals and values, Pew's Flood Prepared Communities Project works to improve flood policy and planning within federal and state government. I'd encourage you to read more about our work at pewtrust.org/floods. But I'll stop here for a moment to lay out a few facts that give urgency to our floods work. Flooding is the costliest and most common natural hazard, costing the nation more than $1 trillion in damages and economic losses since the year 2000. Flood damages and losses affect every state in the US, and in the last 4 years alone, all 50 states have been covered under a federal major disaster declaration. Just last year, 21 different states were impacted by a flood-related major disaster. As a native New Orleanian, I know firsthand the devastating impact floods can have on communities and how long it can take for those communities to recover. I've personally seen countless people show extraordinary resilience in the face of disaster. But no individual, family, or community can be asked, or should be expected, to withstand and bounce back from floods that are becoming more frequent and more severe. That's why pre-disaster mitigation and adaptation planning are so important, and we believe states have a critical role to play. States are linchpins between local and federal government, helping communities access resources and implement solutions. They can also evaluate and address flood risk at the watershed scale, beyond local jurisdictional boundaries. Ideally, state adaptation plans are innovative and comprehensive strategies that combine projections of future risk and robust local community collaboration to offer watershed scale solutions, updated development codes, and nature-based approaches to mitigation. But as both a planner by trade and a former state official, I know just how hard that is. If states are going to develop plans that rise to the challenge of future floods, state leaders will need access to expertise and know-how to guide their efforts. And that's where the State Resilience Partnership comes in. The State Resilience Partnership is a network of non-governmental organizations and academic institutions convened by Pew and the American Flood Coalition and united by a commitment to support state leaders as they craft the next generation of adaptation strategies. To underscore this commitment, the State Resilience Partnership commissioned the Urban Institute to develop a landscape analysis of state planning efforts, identifying common themes, trends, and practices, while highlighting gaps and offering a series of common sense recommendations states can follow to develop better long-term plans. That research was released today, which you can find at the State Resilience Partnership's website, stateresilience.org. Before we take an in-depth look at its findings, I'll also encourage you to follow the State Resilience Partnership on Twitter @StateResilience. And for those of you that are posting on social media during today's webinar, don't forget to use the hashtag #ReadyForResilience. It's now my pleasure to welcome Eric Bernstein, the Urban Institute's principal investigator on the project, to tell us what the new research reveals. Eric is a research associate in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where his research focuses on regional inequality in cities, housing policy, and climate adaptation and mitigation planning. I know we're all eager to hear more about the new research, so over to you, Eric.
Hi, thank you, Matt. I really appreciate that intro. I am looking forward to sharing this with you. As Matt said, we have conducted a research program to look at flood-related planning across the country. We identified a series of plans that span the, I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the slides. Is this, Okay, there we go. The so in any case, resetting. We took a look at 148 plans from across the country that we identified as state-level plans that addressed flood hazard mitigation, adaptation, mitigation, or resilience. We did this in order to take a look at what the landscape of state-level flood planning is like today, and to understand the specific roles and opportunities that states place in the ecosystem of flood-level plans. Next slide, please. The flood planning, as we can see, is sorry. 5 states that were identified through our scan of the 148 plans. As you can see here, this included Colorado, Florida, North Carolina, Iowa, and Washington. We identified these as states that had significant experience with planning around flooding, but were from a diversity of backgrounds and had a different variety of flood risks associated with each. These allowed us to take a deeper dive into how some of the themes we were seeing in the broader scan of the 148 plans were playing out on the ground in a handful of states. So let's take a look at what we found. When we looked at the 148 plans, we found that there was a diversity of experiences. Next slide, please. A diversity of different types of plans that addressed flooding. Most states do not have a deliberate or comprehensive approach to addressing flood hazards. Flood planning was dispersed across various plan types that included, I'm so sorry, I'm still not seeing the slides advancing. In any case, all right, I'll keep going. Most states do not have a deliberate or comprehensive approach to addressing flood hazards. As you can see here, we saw a wide variety of different types of plans. The vast majority were state hazard mitigation plans, and this is because every state and territory is required to have one in order to access federal funds and assistance associated with that. Similarly, 9 plans have a similar role for states in coastal regions. We also saw climate action plans. We included in here climate mitigation and adaptation plans. Water plans, which typically involved watershed management, water cleanliness, and water resources, although, as you can see, some of them did involve flood as well. Resilience plans, only 7 exclusively focused flood plans, 3 emergency management plans, which the ones that we included of those, the direct response plans, were the ones where we saw addressing mitigation, adaptation, and resilience issues. As you can see from this, we can move on to the next slide. Flooding was often only a small component of most plans in the review. Aside from state hazard mitigation plans and coastal plans, the most common plan types were the climate plans and resilience plans, which address shock and stressors across all locally identified hazards. And water plans, which primarily address state management of water resources, including supply and quality, but also may address water-related hazards. We also know that states rely heavily on the FEMA-approved state hazard mitigation plans for their statewide flood risk assessments and mitigation. However, these documents stop short of functioning as a comprehensive strategic plan. Whether states engage in risk assessment, mitigation, or adaptation planning, or other flood planning activities, they must align their approach with state hazard mitigation plan standards to receive federal assistance. Although state hazard mitigation plans provide a centralized location for states to collect and display flood mitigation activities, the existence of a mitigation that are happening within the state. Their ubiquity, however, suggests that these plans do provide a floor for planning expectations in order for states to meet the federal mandate. Meaning that they do provide the benefit of having a certain base standard across all states. Although state hazard mitigation plans are required to cover all hazards present in each state, they frequently function as the primary or only state-level flood risk assessment. In 6 states, which include Iowa, Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, Utah, and Wyoming, the state hazard mitigation plan was the only identified plan in our assessment that addressed flooding. Another key point here is that planning has historically often occurred in response to disasters rather than on a regular and continual basis, with the exception of the state hazard mitigation plans, and relied on historical data rather than forward-looking climate and demographic trends that include social vulnerabilities. This responsive nature to planning has some benefits as well as some costs. It means that there's political expediency and usually a lot of attention on the issue. However, this usually is relatively short-lived and requires a certain loss of life or disaster prior to the plans being available to begin with, or the political will rather being available to begin with. Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, I'll move on. So the reactive approach to address, we already spoke about this. Within state resilience plans, many flood risk models rely on historical data without analyzing future change to fully account for risk. 32% of plans we know rely on historical climate and disaster data without incorporating any projections for the future. Our state deep dives show that this is not the full story, as both Colorado and Iowa have invested significantly in improving their data capabilities outside of the plans that we see available for the state. In Colorado, this investment included the development of the Colorado Hazard Mapping Program, which included expanding the LiDAR topographic data available within the state, field surveys of flood infrastructure, advanced hydrology and hydraulic methods to analyze water flow, and regulatory 2D models. For the Hazard Mapping Project, all data were created to meet FEMA standards. The FEMA committed to reviewing the information to incorporate it into future state hazard mitigation plans. In Iowa, the Iowa Flood Centers developed extensive and near real-time probabilistic inundation maps of a wide range of flood levels that are available elsewhere. Again, these are not reflected in their state-level planning. So we can see that the capabilities of these states are not necessarily reflected in the strategic documents that summarize planning across the state level. We also see that 46% of state hazard mitigation plans currently include climate projections in their risk assessments, despite new requirements from FEMA to include this modeling and incorporate climate change into risk assessments. This indicates that we are moving in the direction of having these kind of climate projections incorporated. However, we are not there yet. Another major missing category is population growth projections, which we don't see incorporated into the risk models in the plans we looked at. In fact, 98% of plans did not incorporate, that had hazard assessments did not incorporate population growth models into their analysis. This is particularly of concern in rapidly growing states. We can think of somewhere like Colorado, where we see rapid growth, especially on the urban-rural frontier, and in areas where we may have flood zones, we may have different types of flood zones that are either not commonly incorporated into these analyses, such as dam overspill territories, as well as a lack of proper organizational structures to account for these in new planning on those sites where we don't necessarily have the standard municipal oversight that we're used to. If we can move on to the next slide. We also see that most state resilience plans do not include data on social vulnerability. Only 24 plans from 22 states of the 148 plans included in our survey had extensive discussion of social vulnerability that clearly connected the geographic risk assessment to discussions of specific vulnerable populations within the area. Survey data that shows that our survey data shows that plans that included social vulnerability analysis typically included only a state-level profile or a more advanced study, but without specifically targeted interventions. One thing that's important to point out here is that even when social vulnerability was incorporated, it was typically done in the terms of social vulnerability indexes overlaid with flood zones, which show where we have higher levels of social vulnerability, that is, populations that are more at risk for harm based on their exposure to flooding. But without understanding necessarily within the analysis the specifics of who those populations are. We know that there are various groups that are socially vulnerable that include people with mobility challenges, such as people with disabilities, low income and renter populations who might have less capability to modify their housing for flood risk, but also groups such as racial and ethnic minorities that have been historically forced to live in areas with greater exposure, as well as deprived opportunities to gain wealth and access to the kind of policy and influences that would allow them to better protect their communities. The next steps here would be to identify which specific populations are exposed and targeting risk assessments, planning, and processes, as well as mitigation activities to their unique needs. We know that groups that have experienced marginalization historically from government planning and economic policies are not going to have the same needs as groups that might need assistance with mobility or might need assistance with housing elevations, for example, although some of these may overlap as well. I want to point out here that this can't be procedural. Analysis, engagement, and outcome goals specifically targeted to improving outcomes. I also want to acknowledge that this problem is systemic and the solution needs to be systemic as well. Lastly here, I want to note that few plans included strategies to assist low capacity localities, which is distinct from those vulnerable communities. Low capacity localities include locations within a state, such as small communities with minimal government, or maybe unincorporated areas that don't have technical resources, may not have staff capability, or the funding to be able to do their own risk assessments, or to track and monitor improvements in local capacity to address flood hazards. While we did see a variety of states making significant attempts to incorporate these communities, we still see this within the data as a significant area of improvement that's needed. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So one of the other major pieces that we look at when we look at the quality of planning is meaningful public engagement. And we know that this is important for a variety of reasons, including both making sure that what we have in our data and what we have in our analysis reflects the reality on the ground and the priority of individuals, but also an educational component, so that we know that communities on the ground, and especially flood-affected communities, are aware of what the state is doing, what resources are available to them, and also what kinds of decisions are being made around their flood protection. We can see that this is a major gap in state level flood planning. We've identified that certain plans, especially some of the newer plans in the resilience space, show very high levels of public engagement, as well as programs like the Iowa watershed approach, but this is not consistent across planning efforts, even within the same state. Many states in the development of their state hazard mitigation plans, which you can remember are often the central plan for understanding flood strategy, see the role of these as collecting local hazard mitigation plans, that the engagement has happened on the local level. However, we know that this doesn't necessarily mean that what's being captured and analyzed at the state level is going to be reflective of statewide community needs overall. We see that just over half of the plans in the survey for which a time frame was developed, for example, for developing these plans, was over the course of 1 year or less. Although we know planning that we don't have a specific length of time attributed as necessary for developing a plan, discussions of public engagement and community-led planning note that gathering public support for a planning process requires significant time and investment for education and trust building, even before meaningful input and feedback can be garnered. Some of the largest engagements were associated, as I said, with new and experimental initiatives. The Iowa Watershed Approach, the Colorado Hazard Mapping Program. We also know that the North Carolina Resilient Communities Program, which is relatively new, has sought to engage local communities across the state as part of an expansion on the work that they did in coastal regions, that they've been doing in coastal regions for a bit longer. However, in other plans, stakeholders frequently noted, as I said, reliance on local governments to foster engagement. Moving on to our to some of our recommendations. We see that better state plans are needed to further efficient and effective resilience goals. One of the key takeaways from this is that states could benefit from establishing a central conceptual source for strategic flood planning that identify values, goals, and outcome indicators to track those to use across all state efforts. This will help with a lot of the fragmenting of the planning process that we see split across various plans and various agencies. Incorporating more rigorous, accurate, and nuanced data for both flood exposure and social vulnerability. We see a lot of investment in this going on, especially in our sample states. However, we also know that this needs to be expanded. The data that are available to most people, to most states, are relying on FEMA data, which is often very outdated for a lot of these areas. And also with social vulnerability, understanding the specific needs, as I said, and the diversity of needs that are required to be addressed for socially vulnerable populations to get adequate protection. We need to incorporate flood-related objectives into day-to-day operations to ensure implementation. This process, which we could call mainstreaming, is often looking at how the kinds of objectives that we have in the high-level plans can be reflected in the sorts of performance assessments and implementation tools that we use. A great example of this comes in Colorado, where we see that some of the resilience objectives that were identified in the state's resilience framework have been incorporated into the state's plans for both assessing performance within a lot of the performance updates and plans for local state programs, as well as into the decision-making rubrics of how to spend state funding on resilience activities. This includes state funding that came from federal sources. So in addition to meeting FEMA requirements, for example, for funding under the State Hazard Mitigation Plan, they also must meet the requirements that are associated with the state's resilience strategy. States can also provide resources, design projects, and share benefits in coordination with local communities within the state. A greater connection between local communities and the state level is going to be very important in understanding local needs and the diversity in those places. We do see efforts in this space, and I don't want to claim that there's a complete lack of this. However, we also saw significant gaps through research. Finally, invest and experiment with community engagement and transparency of flood planning efforts and the resulting plans. This includes both the aspect that I was discussing in terms of planners and those people involved with developing hazard mitigation plans, learning from the communities that they're planning for, but also working with the communities to make sure that they are aware and educated on what the flood issues affecting them are and what states are doing in that space. That's the end of my summary. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to the group.
Thanks, Eric. That was really fascinating and certainly a lot of information for us to all unpack. I also know you were only able to scratch the surface on what's in the report. So again, I'll direct our audience to stateresilience.org to locate the full report. And I'll also remind everyone again to follow the State Resilience Partnership on Twitter @StateResilience and to use the hashtag #ReadyForResilience as you post during today's webinar. It is now my distinct pleasure to bring in a panel of guests who offer unique on-the-ground perspectives on what it takes to develop a statewide plan, and perhaps talk a little bit about what they just heard about the research. First, I'd like to introduce Amanda Martin, North Carolina's Chief Resilience Officer. In her current role with the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, she advances the state's resilience efforts through policy advising, stakeholder engagement, and technical assistance. She has over a decade of experience in climate resilience, disaster recovery, and community development, specialized expertise in post-disaster buyouts from the perspective of resilience, recovery, and racial equity. Next, Ben Duncan is South Carolina's Chief Resilience Officer, who tomorrow will celebrate his one-year anniversary as the state's first CRO. Under Ben's leadership, the newly established South Carolina Office of Resilience is currently developing the state's first resilience plan. Prior to his appointment, Ben spent the previous 6.5 years in various leadership positions within South Carolina's Disaster Recovery Office, and in total has spent 35 years working in public service across several departments within South Carolina state government. Finally, Dave Rosenblatt served as New Jersey's Chief Resilience Officer and Assistant Commissioner for the Climate and Flood Resilience Program in the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. In that capacity, he oversaw the development of New Jersey's first statewide climate change resilience strategy, including its first coastal resilience plan, which was released last year. Previously, Dave served as Assistant Commissioner and Administrator of the Engineering and Construction Program and as Chief of the Atlantic Coastal and South Jersey Bureau and the Division of Watershed Management within New Jersey DEP. Most importantly, he recently started a well-earned retirement following 42 years at the agency. So, first of all, I'd like to offer my heartfelt thanks for all of you to join us here today. And as we just heard, many states are facing significant challenges as they work to develop adaptation plans. Three things in particular that caught my ear are: one, states are struggling to account for future flood risk. Two, they're having difficulty engaging the public in a collaborative way. And three, they're facing challenges directing resources to low capacity communities. I'd be curious if you could each provide some insight on the realities and challenges of putting together these statewide plans from your unique perspectives. Dave, perhaps we can have you lead us off, and Ben and Amanda can chime in from there.
Sure. Thank you, Matthew. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to say, Eric, that was a great summary, and I'm sitting here sweating, hoping that the vulnerabilities that you laid out among the states weren't highlighted in our report, but we'll have further contact with you to make sure that's not the case. First, let me say that we are very privileged here in New Jersey to have a lot of great universities, particularly Rutgers, who have been doing climate research for quite a while. So we have a very good scientific basis on sea level rise, on increased precipitation impacts on our river flood elevations. And so for us, science was not the problem. What was the problem was getting the public to care about and trust the science. I think we've seen a lot of trust issues over the past couple of years. So when we deliver the science to the public, and the universities do the same, what happens is that we're presenting it to the public and they're perceiving personal and economic hardships because of the science, without us even talking about policy issues and how we're going to address the changes in this, the climate changes. So once we get the science accepted, then we have to move on to getting the acceptance of policy decisions. And the only way to do that is to bring the public into the creation of those decisions. They must be part of the process. And in our resilience planning, we have extensive inclusion of the public. We started, once we started putting this report together, we brought in all the state agencies, and all the state agencies, I guess there are 19 of them, all of them have their own constituents. And we have plans to reach out to all the constituents that they have to start getting that, laying that groundwork of the science so that the policy decisions can hopefully easily follow. Now, as far as directing resources to low resource communities, the state agencies have that ability. We have regulations that move us in the direction of highly vulnerable communities. We have grant programs for which we can prioritize financial attention to those communities. So the ability is there. It's just a matter of focusing and always focusing on the low resource communities, as you call them, Mathew. We have, during the process of writing our strategy, we developed a decision support system, which is really like a multi-layer, like 75-layer GIS tool that is very heavy on population information, community makeup, economic makeup, and allowing us to decide, if we put money into a certain area, whether it's flood construction money or whether it's grant money for their use, we can show the powers that be, the big decision makers, why it is we're putting money in a certain location. What is the benefit of that? Who are we protecting? What is the advantage of doing any work in a certain area at all? So I would say that the equity issues, low resource communities are very much part of our plans.
Amanda, you want to pick it up from there?
Sure. Sure. Congratulations, Dave, on your retirement.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. You seem very relaxed, so.
Happy.
So I think that I wanted to follow on thinking of a few challenges. One, I think, is just this general challenge of getting the planning going at a state scale. And I think all of us here today have state plans because we had some executive or legislative or both leadership calling for the development of a state resilience plan. And I don't want to miss the opportunity to say that that component is really important and helpful, that leadership. I think another challenge that we had in crafting our plan is understanding what makes a good plan. What are we striving for? And being at the forefront of this field of state resilience planning, we don't have a ton of examples to look at, and that's where reports like the one that we're discussing today are actually really helpful for states that are looking at doing this kind of work to see, how do we incorporate that component? Oh, they find these 6 recommendations. Are we following each of them? So I just wanted to thank the group that put together the report to say it's really helpful. A challenge that we came across in our work that I think affects all states is figuring out how to wrap our heads around who the implementers are for a state resilience plan. Because really there are state agencies, there's state government, but really we're all implementers of flood resilience work in some way. All public organizations and all private organizations, anyone who owns property really is someone who's potentially in a position to implement a strategy related to flood resilience. And so at the state scale, it can be very challenging to figure out, well, which implementers are we trying to speak to? And there's no one right answer here. In the state sphere, we chose to focus on our state agencies and look at the programs that they administer and their responsibilities, their statutory responsibilities. But other states might make different decisions. And this is relevant because we had some fantastic science that went into our state plan. This idea of how do we get an understanding of current and future flood risk. But what we found is that even with fantastic science, it doesn't translate itself. And so we saw that our work with state agencies really needed to focus and continues to need to focus on translating that science into usable information. Just because we have great science doesn't mean we understand the impacts on our state government responsibilities in the future. And even when we have that understanding, it doesn't mean that we know what to do about it. So there's a lot of layers to figuring out who the implementers are and how to scope that correctly. I think I will save most of my comments about bringing resources into lower capacity or lower wealth communities for later, but I do want to note this is a really big part of what we work on in North Carolina. Many of our communities that are most impacted by flooding have the least staff on hand to kind of take a step back, do something strategic, think differently, think outside the box. They are busy doing everything they can to keep their town running. And they do not have the privilege or the luxury to do this kind of resilience planning. And so we do have a few technical assistance programs that we're working on, but it remains a big challenge to our work to figure out how do we best serve those communities that are most impacted.
Thanks for that, Amanda. I'd like to bring Ben into the discussion, and I think, Ben, you bring a unique perspective in that, unlike Amanda and Dave, who have worked on plans that have since been released, you're sort of in the middle of a process in which you and your team are developing a plan on behalf of South Carolina. So perhaps you can describe some of the challenges you may be facing as part of that process.
Sure, I'll be happy to. But if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about the evolution of us getting to resilience planning. As you may know, we had the last hurricane that we had, or before the series of hurricanes that we were presidentially declared for, was in 1989. That was Hurricane Hugo. We didn't have another hurricane until 2015, and then another one in 2016, and then a third in 2018. So that's how we've got that evolution started to move towards resilience. The governor saw at a certain point that we needed to be planning and not just reacting to disasters. And I remember we were serving communities after Hurricane Florence. That was the last one we had in 2018. And I remember going to one of our recovery centers in Horry County, which is near Myrtle Beach, which Myrtle Beach is in Horry County. We served the people that day, and we were primarily serving those that are low to moderate income. And at the end of the day, I was headed back to Columbia, and I got this call to meet the governor and 4 legislators in this meeting. And when I heard that I had to turn around and come back to Horry County or Conway, I said, this is not going to be good. And we met with those legislators, and it was not a good meeting because they said things that we weren't doing that we should be doing. And that's when we decided that we needed to move towards a resilience plan. The governor saw that, so he immediately put together a flood commission to look at the problems and what can we do to resolve those issues. And in the flood commission report, it says we needed an Office of Resilience. And at that point, we were established as Office of Resilience in September of 2020. But it was in a special session, so the budgeting process had already passed. So we didn't get funded until July 1 of 2021. And at that point, we pulled everything together. We had federal funding prior to that, so we couldn't do any state work with prior to the July 1, 2021. And so we pulled together all of the agencies. We hired the staff. There are 56 state government agencies and nonprofit organizations that are assisting us. The information that we had, we used the First Streets report to help us get started looking at flooding and where we're going in the future with flooding. And with that, we're miles down the road. We're not there yet, But again, we were funded in July 1, 2021, and they wanted a resilience plan July 1, 2022. That's 1 year. We're working now to get an extension. However, we will have a report. It will not be the comprehensive report that we need, because that's almost impossible to get it done in a year. But we've asked for an extension so that we'll have a complete report by July 1 of 2022. But we are working hard every day, pulling that together with all of the partners to have a comprehensive report completed.
That's awesome, Ben. I think we're all eagerly awaiting to dive into that report when it is completed. And obviously, it's my pleasure on behalf of Pew to be working with you and your team to provide a bit of guidance and assistance on that as you move forward in your process. I want to take a sort of a deeper dive on the answer that you just gave, Ben. And the research unveiled today describes sort of this big picture state planning landscape. But we all know that each state has its own different motivations and frankly viewpoints, and everything from climate change to local political perspectives, which you just described in some of your post-disaster work. And these all have an impact on how states address this big, broad topic of flood planning. And so I'd be curious to hear from all of you, how have you navigated these specific issues in developing effective plans that can be implemented and really embraced on the ground? So Ben, maybe I'll go ahead and turn back to you to provide some context there, as it sounds like you've put a lot of thought into this topic already.
Sure. First of all, our primary people that we serve are the ones that normally don't get served. That's always been with the disaster recovery and through the resilience plan. We're using data in the latest scientific data that we can find to help put this plan together. Again, we're using Pew Foundation information now, and you all have been helping us greatly, and we do appreciate that. And again, we have a lot of partners. The climatology office in the state, the universities, all of our research universities. I can't leave them all. I can't just mention one and not mention the others. We're using the flood mitigation office in the Department of Natural Resources, and so we're working hard and moving in the direction of putting this information together. Where we've struggled is in the low to moderate income community because of COVID. We have videos, we have the web that we're trying to reach them, but we are reaching out trying to engage the low to moderate communities as part of our target audience so that they won't get left out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and maybe I'll pick up there with our next question. It's a bit of a follow-up, right? The research shows that few plans meaningfully considered social vulnerability factors or included specific strategies targeting assistance to these low-capacity communities, as Eric described. However, Ben, you're sort of talking about how you're approaching it. I know North Carolina and New Jersey took their own approaches to address this problem. So I'm just wondering if maybe one of you can dive in on this equity question in the context of planning. And perhaps Amanda, maybe you can kick us off on this topic.
Sure. So I think we're actually talking about two components here. I think on one hand, we're talking about a process for developing a plan and engaging communities equitably in that process. And then the other one, I think, is how we deal with the intersection of social and physical flood vulnerability, and how do we target those issues. And I'll touch on both briefly. I think in terms of process, this is something, again, to pose a big question, what does good community engagement for a statewide plan actually look like? We have 10 million people in our state, and we can't just do outreach to we can't just blanket the state in outreach requests or in meetings. One, it's not cost effective, and two, you only get the loudest voice. And so we did a number of workshops in different places, and we also have a number of standing committees of people whose job it is to represent certain kinds of interests or certain kinds of stakeholders. So that's one thing I would really highlight, is thinking about who can you find whose job it is to represent underrepresented groups, rather than trying to do one-off engagement opportunities to get residents into a hall or something like that. So that's one thought on the process side. And then in terms of the outcome, I think this is so important for us to be weaving equity concerns throughout our plans. North Carolina did a chapter on climate justice that really focused on the intersection of equity issues and climate vulnerabilities. And they don't always look the way you think they will. I mean, some of the equity issues that we're talking about, yes, are driven by historic discrimination in the housing market, housing located in the floodplain. But other kinds of equity issues come from the structure of our policies, the fact that we are better able to invest in elevations or weatherproofing homes that are owner occupied. And that leaves renters out, you know, or the grant programs that we have naturally tend to benefit those communities that have staff that are able to take time out of their day to write a great grant application. And so some of those equity issues require unpacking. And so it's not just an issue of engagement. Engagement is really important throughout the process and challenging, as Ben was talking about. But it's also about really figuring out, what does equity look like for us? Is it just, as the analysis shows, sometimes there's an element of it that's overlaying a map of drivers of social vulnerability with physical, floodplains. That's part of it. But many of the social vulnerability issues aren't going to get mapped like that. And so we need to create space to dig into them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you talk about outreach, engagement, and the connection to equity. In my own practice, I've always thought about this idea of it has to be built in this foundation of trust, right? And in order to have trust, you have to build a relationship. You have to meet people where they are. You have to take the time and the effort required to actually get to know folks, and for those people to get to know you. And I think if you put in that time and effort, good things can happen, but it's a difficult undertaking. Dave, I see you've come on camera. I'm thinking maybe you may have a comment to add here on how you might have addressed this engagement and equity topic through the context of your planning effort.
Yeah, so one of our guiding principles as we developed the plan was that there will be no winners or losers for the communities in the state of New Jersey as we develop an approach to climate change. Now, frankly, there will be perceptions of winners and losers. If you're a community and you see another community get $200 million in flood control and you don't get it, and that repeats itself over the whole state multiple times, yeah, you're going to feel like you weren't dealt with fairly. But the report, the strategy indicates that not everyone's going to get flood construction money. We're not going to be able to engineer our way out of all the flood problems that climate change is going to cause. We're going to have to do planning. And some communities will not be protected as they exist today. They'll have to, move away from the flood areas a bit into the higher ground in those communities. So it's the strategy is inclusive. It just may not deliver what everybody wants in each community. Often people want to stay where they are. They want everything to be like it was. They want the same views from the homes. They want, not everybody's going to come out feeling like a winner, but we have an obligation to provide the best protection into the future against climate change. And, we intend to do that with planning, with regulation, and with construction as money allows. Thankfully, we have the Corps of Engineers on our side and FEMA on our side. And, I think municipalities are getting the idea that they too are going to have skin in this game and have to put aside resources to deal with the impacts. And it's not just flooding, it's also, temperature rise in inner cities. How are we going to deal with that? We already have problems because of the heat islands in metro areas, and it's only going to get worse. So the plan lays out, well, before we had the plan, the strategy, we had the scientific report that laid all this out. And that is what you turn to, we turn to as we develop the strategy. That's what the public needs to look at as they start to wrap their minds around this. And then you get into the plan, the strategy, and the actions that are necessary. So there's something for everyone in here. And whatever level of government, whatever level of the community can engage, should engage, and participate.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But unfortunately, I feel like I've gotten through about a third of my scripted questions today, but we've sort of run out of time on our panel discussion here today. But I will encourage the audience to, if you haven't taken a look at New Jersey's climate change resilience strategy and the resilience plan in North Carolina, I would strongly encourage you all to take a look at those documents. And obviously, stay tuned as Ben and his team continue to develop a plan on behalf of the people of South Carolina. So thank you again. I appreciate you all joining us on our panel today. And with that, I will transition to the next portion of our event today. But before I do, I'd like to remind everyone again to follow us on Twitter @StateResilience and to use today's hashtag #ReadyForResilience. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to Elizabeth Wilson, Pew's Senior Director of Environmental Policy, to introduce our next discussion. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. Given what we've heard from the state report and today's panel, I imagine that I'm not alone in having a renewed appreciation for the pressing need to harmonize efforts across all levels of government to comprehensively address the nation's flood resilience gap. With every challenge comes opportunity, which is why I'm delighted to introduce you to our fireside chat between Laura Lightbody, the Project Director of Pew's Flood Prepared Communities Initiative, and Brenda Mallory, Chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, to discuss how we can tackle this issue through whole of government approaches. Chair Mallory is the 12th chair of CEQ and the first African American to serve in this position. In this role, she advises the President on environmental and natural resource policies that improve, preserve, and protect public health and the environment for America's communities. She is focused particularly on advancing the Biden-Harris administration's ambitious climate and environmental justice agenda in ways that spur opportunities for job growth and economic development. A trailblazer in many respects, Chair Mallory is the 5th woman to sit at the helm of CEQ, and we celebrate this today on International Women's Day. This discussion couldn't be more timely. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just released its report on climate change impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. It found, first, that the effects of climate change on ecosystems and human well-being are accelerating and worsening. Second, that current unsustainable development patterns are increasing exposure of people and ecosystems to climate hazards. And finally, that the most vulnerable people and systems across all sectors and regions are being disproportionately affected by climate change. It makes very clear that our efforts to adapt to risks and withstand hazards must outpace both current and predicted changes to our climate. The implications could fundamentally reshape communities and ecosystems in the coming decades if we don't temper greenhouse gas emissions and find ways to adapt. Pew's Flood Prepared Communities Initiative is working to help communities and the environment adapt by reducing unsustainable development and enhancing the role that nature can play in reducing flood risks. Laura Lightbody leads this work for us, and I'm excited to hear what she and Chair Mallory have to say about some of the solutions on the table that both the federal government and state actors can help to advance. On behalf of everyone tuning in and on behalf of the Pew Charitable Trusts, I want to thank Chair Mallory for her time today and the critical role she continues to play in advancing progress with respect to issues such as conservation and environmental justice. And with that, Laura, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and good afternoon to everyone that has joined us today. I'm so honored to have the chance to speak with Chair Mallory on this timely topic, as Elizabeth just laid out. We will be rejoined by Amanda Martin of North Carolina and Ben Duncan of South Carolina, who each have questions for Chair Mallory. But first, let's start by hearing Chair Mallory's reaction. I just want to make sure she has joined us. Yes, here she is.
Hi there.
Good to see you. I just want to hear your reaction to this discussion about the landscape of state resilience planning and the challenges faced by states. It's clear, and we've heard, that states are eager to be proactive and plan for future risks, but there are many challenges, whether that be resources, budgets, data, guidance. We often hear in our work calls from state leaders for direction and leadership from the federal government on adaptation. Let's kick off this conversation by hearing a little bit about what this administration is doing to support states and advance climate adaptation.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Laura, for inviting me to join you all today. And I'm glad that I had an opportunity to hear a few minutes of the previous speakers, because they, in some ways, epitomize the level of expertise that we know exists in the state and local governments, and the folks who are like on the front line sort of tackling these issues on a day-to-day basis. And so I'm grateful for just the dedication that those folks, as well as everyone who is participating on this call, show every day in the work that you're doing. So let me start off by just kind of providing like a broad overview of the areas in which we are concentrating in the Biden administration right now. I think they fall into really three main buckets. And the first is really just federal dollars. We are fortunate, because of the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, to have money to actually dedicate to these issues. Secondly, providing guidance and standards and data sharing. That's a big role that the federal government often plays and that we're playing now. And then I think third, we are managing to a better extent our own federal footprint, which, as you know, is all across the country in many communities, and therefore has spillover effects in those communities. So let me just go down one level more, and starting with the bipartisan infrastructure law, which the president signed, just over 100 days ago. This includes $50 billion for climate resiliency programs. And the White House released the first edition of its bipartisan infrastructure law guidebook to help state, local, tribal, and territorial governments unlock and understand the benefits of the historic investments that we're preparing to make in the nation's infrastructure. And in addition, the president signed an executive order 14052, which identified the requirement that for bipartisan infrastructure law projects, they must be resilient to climate risk. And so this is a critical kind of first step to ensuring that the best use of taxpayer dollars is in response to the climate conditions that we're facing. Secondly, on the point of guidance and coordination, in the executive order that the president signed in his first week, he established that the federal government was going to be using a whole of government response to dealing with climate change broadly, but specifically relates to resilience as well. And so from the White House, we've established 5 new interagency working groups to enhance our climate resilience approach. There's one on coastal resilience, flood resilience, drought relief, extreme heat, and wildfire resilience. And I think that was really a reflection of the fact that each of these crises that we deal with. They're all coming at once to people, but they have unique features and different aspects that require different levels of expertise on different agencies. And so we're using this as our mechanism to really guide the whole of government approach to sort of tackling the issue. And it allows us really to be able to kind of manage kind of across the government, the kind of partnerships that are necessary, both between the agencies, but also with the agencies, with their partners, some of you in the states. The 5 groups, the interagency working groups, also are really prioritizing listening to the state, territory, tribal, and local government stakeholders. Because just as we heard from the previous speakers, there's just tremendous expertise in the states about the nature of what your challenges are. And so I think one of the things that's important to us as we're moving forward in these working groups is to make sure that we understand what we're trying to help solve, and that we align the work that we're doing in that way. 2 quick examples of work going on in the working groups. In the Coastal Resilience Working Group, this is been set up to address efforts that, to coordinate efforts that address the needs of the local communities to implement the coastal resiliency efforts. And we're using that to align the involvement of the of coastal resilience with the various federal dollars and the data that is being generated. And similarly, on the Wildfire Resilience Infrastructure Group, we're creating in that context a Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission that's going to be made up of state, territory, tribal, and local experts, including non-federal members. And so we're hoping to use this task force to kind of study some of the strategies to prevent and mitigate some of the damages that are caused in the wildfire area. And finally on this, one of the things that we've prioritized in the administration is the setting up the requirement that the federal agencies have created their own climate adaptation plans that's led by CEQ's Office of Sustainability. And so in this process, we've got senior leadership across the federal government who is really focused on climate adaptation and resilience plans and what's necessary in order to protect the federal agency and its interaction and its responsibilities for serving the American people. And so those, again, given the specific programs that are involved, the focus in those areas, obviously vary. So for example, FEMA is very focused among its activities on the National Flood Insurance Program as something that it is using to update and better align with some of the needs that we're seeing. And agencies like NOAA are really focused on their making sure that their data that is so critical and is available and accessible to the public. They just recently released a report that actually focuses on sea level rise and really shows how dire our current circumstances.
Thanks so much for laying that out. And it's so good to hear that these task forces have been created that will really bring in outside folks outside of the government to help formulate and really ensure that you are getting that whole of government approach from local to federal. I thought we could touch on, drill down a little bit more on a piece that you touched on, which is that infrastructure bill and really thinking through some of the solutions that we want localities to put into place. So one of the solutions that we really work to advance at Pew is nature-based solutions, right? Using nature to absorb flood waters in addition to all of the other co-benefits that it can have, often being a more cost-effective solution, providing ecosystem benefits and sometimes other community benefits. How can the federal government really help ensure that that $1.2 trillion infrastructure package is supporting nature-based solutions and other sort of climate forward projects to ensure they're lasting and durable?
Yeah, so first of all, Laura, I mean, we absolutely agree about the importance of the nature-based solutions in the overall challenge of addressing climate change. And I think that there is a tremendous focus across the government right now in sort of looking at what those opportunities are. The bipartisan bill does provide unprecedented opportunity to kind of deploy some of these solutions, again, because of the extent of the funding that's available. And just one example, if you take the Everglades, where we are making a $1 billion investment, the largest ever, to accelerate the pace of restoration. And restoring the natural flows of water into and through the Everglades is essential, not only to the health of the ecosystem, but to delivering clean drinking water and better protecting the region. So we're obviously using that opportunity to really enhance this part of the president's agenda. Similarly, today the Department of Interior is inviting project proposals for a $162 million investment that they're making in the Klamath River Basin to kind of help restore the health and natural systems and address long-running kind of drought issues there. So another example of a kind of large-scale nature-based project that again has a lot of history, but we see an opportunity here to try to solve some of those big problems with the nature approach. I think overall, there is approximately $50 billion in resilience in the infrastructure law, and we see the nature-based solution and strategies that emerge as a major focus of how we want this investment to be used.
And I think those were great examples in different parts of the country to help illustrate how they can be used to solve for different solutions too. So let me switch gears a little bit. One of the prominent challenges that has been a theme throughout this discussion from the research that was released today, state flood resilience and adaptation planning, and the conversation that some of the CROs hit on with Matt, was sort of the glaring absence of equitable solutions when it comes to climate adaptation and resilience. The report actually found a whopping 84% of state plans, do not or only minimally consider how flooding will disproportionately affect socially vulnerable communities. Can you shed a little light for us on how the administration approaches this issue and how it's working to ensure the nation as a whole bridges this equity gap when it comes to climate and adaptation solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that, you've seen President Biden emphasize really from day one is the importance of really trying to address the inequities that are kind of embedded in some of our structure. I mean, equity is one of the key pillars of his agenda. And so as a result, we have been very focused from day one on ensuring that we create the structures and the framework that allow us as a federal government to actually prioritize equity in the way we approach our overall programs. So just specifically, one of the programs that is really a key feature of the president's agenda is the Justice 40 initiative, which is a program that is designed to have the federal government, when it comes to the overall benefits associated with climate and clean energy activities, to prioritize 40% of the overall benefits to what we call disadvantaged communities. Those are communities that have largely been underinvested in over the years. And so this program, which has a pilot, we started a pilot back in July that focused in on 21 specific programs that we could use to kind of learn and understand what it would mean to try to scale up a goal of this type. Also includes a program that relates to resilience. So the HUD has a community development block grant program that is focused on housing recovery after disasters. And it's one of the Justice 40 programs that we're using to see how you would have to implement the program in order to make sure you're dealing with some of the climate and extreme weather circumstances. The other thing that is a really important part of how we are overall just trying to make sure that that equity issues are getting attention is ensuring that we're kind of engaging and consulting with kind of key members of the environmental justice and local communities. And so here we created, or the president created, again, early part of the administration, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is a federal advisory council that's made up of 26 kind of longtime environmental justice advocates and experts who are providing advice to us and recommendations across a broad range of issues. And most recently, we've just established as part of the advisory council a specific focused work group that is looking at resilience and resilience-related issues. And then finally, an activity that's ongoing right now is CQ just released a week or so ago a climate and economic justice screening tool as a draft. And this is a tool that we're going to be using to help us to identify disadvantaged communities across the country. So it's a mapping tool, and it's based on kind of criteria that's related to kind of environmental, climate-related factors, as well as socioeconomics. And together, it's going to identify the group or area within a community that we believe is disadvantaged and that we should be prioritizing as we do our funding. And that's out for a 60-day comment period right now. So for folks on the line, if you have a chance to take a look at that and see how it meets the reality in your communities, that would be really helpful to us. You just visit screeningtool.geoplatform.gov, and it's sort of self-explanatory from there.
Well, thanks. I think that's a good segue. I want to bring back into the conversation Amanda Martin, the Chief Resilience Officer of North Carolina, for a question about community engagement. Amanda?
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Chair Mallory. It's so exciting to hear you talk about this work and hearing about how the federal government, how the White House are thinking about these issues. It's very energizing from the state perspective, so thank you. I have a question about projects, and we're very excited about the amount of funding that we're seeing coming out of the bipartisan infrastructure bill and how it will become available in our state. I'm in North Carolina. And at the same time, we see a sort of bias or an excitement about spending money on projects, and we all share it. But the challenge is that many of our communities aren't actually at the place where they know what the right project is, or they haven't had the chance to do an assessment or to think in an innovative way about addressing their flooding issues or addressing climate change. And often these are more rural communities, poorer communities with fewer resources. And so I'm wondering if the administration has been thinking at all about how to bridge that gap.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you, Amanda, for that. I mean, again, that's a perfect example of kind of recognizing sort of the kind of weaknesses and gaps in a system that we're trying to make sure that we don't kind of repeat problems of the past. I mean, there's a reason that certain communities are often disinvested in and have been historically. And among those is the kind of the inability to kind of jump right in and be able to submit a grant on kind of a minute's notice on a particular issue. So the bipartisan infrastructure law itself actually includes a good amount of money on resilience planning in programs. Like, we understand that it's important that that there is an opportunity to actually do the development that's necessary to kind of put these programs together. And also that for some communities, because of both a technical lack of technical experience and because of capacity issues, that those are things that we also have to be able to help address as well. So for example, FEMA has $1 billion from bill funds for its Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, which provides funds for capacity building, including activities that enhance like the knowledge and skills and expertise of its current workforce of communities. So like that's something where we kind of realize that if we want to make sure everybody is getting the benefit, that we have to also help some folks to actually be able to compete. And similarly, there's a program, also a BRIC program called Direct Technical Assistance that provides for this additional early stage planning. So I think those are examples of things that that currently exist. But I think just as a mindset, there very much is, when you talk across the federal government, talk to the secretaries of the agencies in particular, this orientation towards the fact that we know that we have to behave differently and in order to ensure that all communities really get the benefit of these programs that we are advancing and that we see opportunities in. And so that is how I think they're kind of coming in the kinds of questions that are being asked when people are looking at specific programs. So, you know, in addition to the FEMA programs, the Department of Transportation has a $7 billion program that's called Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, Cost-Saving Transportation. Protect, remember that. And again, this is one where the funds are designed to kind of, you know, help with resilience planning and to strengthen, you know, they can be associated with strengthening evacuation routes and increasing resilience writ large. So those are just some examples, I think, that are specific to how some of the funding is being used.
Thanks, Amanda. Great response. And Chair Mallory, and we've really seen as more money has become available through the federal government, whether that be through transportation or HUD or FEMA, that more resources have been dedicated to support technical assistance in planning and capacity building, which I really think has been called for from the ground up, and it seems like the federal government has responded. So that's great. I want to make sure that we get another question in here. We're going to bring back into the conversation Ben Duncan, who is the Chief Resilience Officer with the South Carolina Office of Resilience. We have both Carolinas represented here on the conversation and the call. Ben's here to talk a little bit about the reactive nature of disasters and governments and how to tip the scale more toward planning and preparedness. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You probably heard me say earlier that we've had 3 major disasters within 4 years. What can we do? And when I say we, the states and along with the federal government, what can we do to work closer together and be more proactive? South Carolina is a poor state, and we deal with a lot of issues. In those last disasters, we've repaired or replaced over 3,050 homes. What can we do to be more proactive, and what can we do to help reduce those risks?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and one that I do think like the framework for disasters historically has not focused on the long term. It's been more focused on the, you know, event by event. And one of the things that just in the bipartisan infrastructure funding that's been made available, that one of the things that the president has made as a requirement of our funding under that is a recognition that we have to be looking at what's resilient to climate risk. So there's created within the current system of the way that we're approaching funding, almost like a requirement that proactive planning be very much a part of the way that we are thinking about the federal expenditure of funds for sure. And I think that our basic view is like these events, because of where we are on climate change, are just going to continue to increase and be happening with greater frequency. The reference to the IPCC report at the top just is further evidence of that. The other thing that we're sort of thinking about is one of the big risks, obviously the flooding. The flood risk management standard is one of those other areas in which we're trying to make the adjustments in the various federal programs so that people are building to levels that are more protected. And again, to build in that notion that we have to recognize that we can't continue to count on what has been the historic patterns, because the historic patterns are changing. So having the data and information available to understand kind of directionally where we're heading, and then making that part of the requirement. I think those are going to be important tools to help us be prepared for the inevitable events that seem to be coming our way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And one thing I'm really optimistic about, Ben, to your point, is that we have seen historic investments from the federal government over the past 5-6 years in pre-disaster and mitigation resources that we have never seen available before. And so the institutionalization of preparedness and planning, we're really beginning to realize that. And the hope is that the state partners really help to see that play out at the state level. So I want to end by just asking, really, Chair Mallory, what's on the horizon? We're in year 2 now of the Biden-Harris administration, and I think all of the audience and the listeners would just love to hear from you. You mentioned the agency adaptation plans, but what else is to come from CEQ and this administration with respect to adaptation?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I feel like a lot of work was done in the 2021 that sort of set up the activities that are kind of going to have actual on the ground impacts in 2022. The flood standard being one of those examples where I think we're going to make some progress there so that we can start to see things that are built to actually meet a more protective standard that's necessary. I think we're just looking at some of the other work that we're doing where there are going to be opportunities to really pull together the funding and make sure that under the overall agenda that the president has set up, that we're actually distributing money that is recognizing the values that we have for climate, for equity, for labor in all of the funding that goes out. And over the course of this program, we've talked about the billions of dollars for various activities that are covered, like weatherization and flood mitigation and resilience, and generally even agencies like the Army Corps having a kind of resilience kind of direction. So I think all of those will continue, and the partnerships that we are building along the way through these work groups and through some of the workshops that we're having with the public are going to be really an important part of actually building out what the opportunities will be for advancing a climate and resilience kind of oriented program that really both leverages the work that's already happening, but hopefully provides the resources for states and local governments to really be able to put in place things that will be longstanding.
Well, that's great to hear, and you definitely have a partner in Pew and many of these state CROs as well in terms of implementing some of the great work from the federal government. I just want to thank you, Chair Mallory, for your time, your insightful conversation and leadership. We look forward to continuing the conversation with this administration, as well as all the folks on the phone. I want to just briefly thank our guest speakers, Amanda Martin, Dave Rosenblatt of New Jersey, and Ben Duncan for shedding light on their state experiences. And our partners, the State Resilience Partnership and the Urban Institute. You can continue the conversation with us on Twitter @StateResilience using the hashtag #ReadyForResilience. It was a pleasure to have all of you with us today. Chair Mallory, thank you. And this concludes the event.
All right, thank you, Laura. Bye-bye.
Thank you.